I'm going to add a fifth fact, and that's the empty tomb. Now, this isn't part of Habermas's minimal facts. Notwithstanding, it's still well evidenced, and it's granted by around 75% of all scholars today, but it's not granted by nearly all of them, like the other four minimal facts. Thus, we see that there's good evidence for the empty tomb. William Wand of Oxford University writes, "All the strictly historical evidence we have is in favor of the empty tomb, and those scholars who reject it ought to recognize that they do so on some other ground than that of scientific history." So here's where we are. We've established not only that Jesus died, but that his tomb was empty.
Okay. What you have not shown is that if the resurrection occurred, that we would find likely the empty tomb, the appearances to any degree.
By the way, I have not mentioned the empty tomb this evening. I don't know why you keep bringing it up.
Go ahead.
So you got some good evidence, I think, for the empty tomb. The reason I don't include it is, by the way, you do have a heterogeneous majority who grant it. So you even have some non-believers who grant it. You have a couple other non-believers, scholars who think the tomb was empty. So you could say it's a heterogeneous majority, but by far the majority of scholars who grant the empty tomb are Christian scholars. And it doesn't come up to the level, even though it's a majority, if it's around 75%, that's a pretty strong majority. But I like it to be 90% or more for what I'm doing here, for my criteria for accepting something as historical bedrock. So it didn't quite make a strong enough majority, and it's certainly not a robust heterogeneity of scholarship that is granting it. So although I believe the tomb was empty, and I think the evidence is sufficient for that, it doesn't raise to the level of being a minimal fact, of being historical bedrock.
Yeah. Now, John Dominic Crossan, although he would admit that Christ died on the cross, says he was probably laid over in some trash heap and torn apart by the... He doesn't believe this tomb idea. Now, the tomb in which Jesus was buried, talk about that. What's the evidence?
Yeah, the burial.
Well, okay. First of all, let's get him buried. Was he buried in a tomb? What's the evidence for that?
Well, the interesting thing about Crossan is very few of his colleagues agree with him here. There's not a bit of evidence, not a bit, that says that Jesus was buried in an unknown plot and chewed up. And there's a lot of data to think that he was... Let's put it this way. The data I'll get to in a second on the empty tomb all argues that he was buried in a separate plot. But there's not any data. And it's usually the Christians. We're often thought of as Christians being put back on their heels saying, where's the data, where's the data? But I wonder where Dr. Crossan says he was buried in a common grave and chewed up by dogs. I think it's real easy. You say, give me one source.
Well, I've been wanting to ask a historian this question for a long time now. And it's another common objection that I see is that most probably Jesus' body would have been thrown into a mass grave. So my question is, what is the earliest historical evidence we have of Jews criminals being thrown into a mass grave? Does it come at the time of Nero, around 70 AD, or does it come before then? Because it seems to me like that's the earliest evidence that we have of these mass graves.
Okay, first of all, you're going to be hard put to nail exact historical references when it was done. But I would concede, and many would, that that's what happened to most people, not necessarily mass graves, but a little classier would be a rectangular square in the ground, like today, only without a casket. And you put the body on top of it and covered up. That would be kind of a classy one. A mass grave would be, garbage, in a garbage heap or something. But it's a totally moot point. It's a totally moot point because, like I say to people, let's take your theory. Give me your best shot. What do you want to say? They put it in a garbage dump, and by Sunday, it was already burned up from the smoldering ashes that were always burning.
Or dogs may have eaten it.
Dogs may have eaten it. And I'll just go, that's cool. So what's wrong? Well, I don't know. The gospel story of Joseph is incorrect, or part of it is. He may have been the one that put him in the common grave, but for the most part, the gospel story would be wrong. And I'd say...
Joseph of Arimathea.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd say, okay, so what do you have here? You got a moot point. You picked a horrible example because Jesus could have died on Friday, been thrown in a trash heap, had his body eaten and or burned or both. And guess what's going to happen Sunday? What if he appears anyway?
Let me talk about Mike's facts and Mike's methods. Mike gives 3 facts, and these sound impressive because there are 3 of them. And anytime you've got 3, you just need a poem and you've got a sermon. His 3 facts are that Jesus died by crucifixion, that his disciples claimed to see him alive afterwards, and that he appeared to Paul. I submit to you these are not 3 facts pertaining to the resurrection. One of the 3 has nothing to do with the resurrection, and the other 2 are the same. The crucifixion of Jesus is irrelevant to the question of whether he was raised from the dead. Yes, of course he had to be crucified, but crucifixion isn't necessary for the resurrection because he could have been stoned to death and been raised from the dead. He could have drowned and been raised from the dead. He could have fallen off a cliff and be raised from the dead. The crucifixion is not anything that is related inherently to the question of resurrection. So I don't know why that's being cited as a fact. If the fact is that Jesus died, well, that's not much of a fact. We're all going to die. The crucifixion is not in any way a fact related to the resurrection per se. He's got 2 facts that relate to the resurrection, which are that the disciples claimed to see him alive afterwards and that he appeared to Paul. Both of those are the same thing. There are people who claim to see Jesus alive afterwards, one of whom was Paul, one of whom was Cephas, one of whom was James. They're a group of people who claim to have seen Jesus alive afterwards. It's not 2 facts, it's 1 fact.
Let's see, you said when bodies go missing, we don't assume resurrection. And I would generally agree, I would agree with that. But I guess with this, okay, if they don't go missing, or if they go missing, we don't assume resurrection. Agreed. But if there's no claims, he dies and all of a sudden his body turns up missing. Do I assume he's risen from the dead? No. But let's suppose that, all right, let's get back to Koresh. Koresh did predict that he would rise from the dead 3 years later. Let's say that they had his charred remains in the coroner's office, and all of a sudden, 3 years later, someone goes to check and it's gone. I think we could look for some naturalistic explanations there. However, the fact that he predicted his resurrection, Koresh, puts him in a different category as my grandfather. If my grandfather's corpse goes missing, it's not resurrection. Nobody thinks about that. But if David Koresh's corpse goes missing 3 years later, then you got a problem. Houston, we got a problem. We got something we got to look at here and give it a little more consideration. Would you agree with that?
Well, not that in and of itself wouldn't be anything, because his prediction could actually have caused one of his surviving followers to actually steal the ashes, for example. So you already have an automatic causal hypothesis to investigate.
But I think that the passion predictions are based on things Jesus said. But I don't understand why this is a plus for apologists. I don't understand why this isn't a plus for polemicists, even though I haven't seen them take it up. So here is what I would say if I were a skeptic, which I am not. But if I were a skeptic, I would say, well, Jesus prophesied catastrophe and redemption. He prophesied tribulation and vindication. He prophesied death and resurrection. So why are the passion predictions being historical good news? Why aren't they ammunition for the skeptic who says, well, maybe somebody stole the body? And then people said, well, Jesus prophesied death. He was right. He prophesied resurrection. Well, he's right about that too. Anyway, you can see where a skeptic could go here.
Robert asked one of them, but the other one I was going to ask is, I know that Mike has written, I forget which journal it was, about Jesus' resurrection predictions, and he believes that those are historical. And he also mentioned him performing miracles and doing stuff like that. Could someone not argue that that would create expectation for them to see Jesus if he told them he was going to rise from the dead, and they believed he was miraculous and all that stuff? Obviously, that wouldn't apply to Paul, but I could see someone imagining that if Jesus said he was going to die and resurrect, and he died, and the disciples were waiting there grieving and like, oh, wait a minute, maybe I can see Jesus or some way. Is there any way that could happen?
Yeah, sure that could happen.